In this lesson, we'll be further exploring our thumbnailing process and how to best approach making different variations and different explorations before moving forward. In the full design process, it's best to do different iterations of ideas to try and explore kind of field of possibilities more widely, so that then you can pick something more confidently that you feel is going to work. So there's a few things you want to keep in mind when you're doing that process. Our real goal is to explore as many options as we can to generate as many ideas as possible. So in order to do that, you would want to specifically try and find ways to vary up what you are drawing. Here is a lineup of thumbnails that I've made for this class. As you can see, they all look very, very different. So what I've deliberately done for this process is I wanted to have as large a range as possible of options to pick from. So generally, you want to try and kind of find extremities of ideas you go for, and you want to try and find as many variables to break up. For example, with the first one, I approached it very much like a vehicle. And as soon as I've done a sketch like that, it's good to think of what is the counterpoint to this? What is the most opposite way that I can approach a mech? So number 5 is then a good example of me going the opposite direction, of approaching it very much like a humanoid instead of a vehicle. This is more in the vein of something like Gundam, the kind of typical more mecha Japanese shows that would approach a mech kind of almost like a large metal warrior, more than just a vehicle. So I've deliberately explored a possibility like that. And I've also tried to explore a lot of different ways of mechanics. You want to try and find variables about the design that you can vary up, and then you want to deliberately try and make sure you have thumbnails exploring that. So another one that I deliberately explored there is its way of mobility and its amount of limbs. So that's why, for example, number 3 is just two-legged, almost like an ostrich. Then number 1 has 6 legs, and then number 5 is humanoid with human arms and legs as the inspiration. And then number 2, for example, then has a completely different way that the shoulder joints are made, far more complicated limbs. You can also see that I've taken a lot of different shape inspirations. Number 4 is very squared off, while number 4 and 5 are both more faceted, while number 6 and number 2 are very rounded in the kind of shapes I've chosen. So your deliberate intent is to make sure that there's a lot of variety and difference in the thumbnails. It is very easy when you are doing a series of sketches to inadvertently end up drawing essentially variations of the same sketch. Sometimes you can get enamored with an idea, or you're just thinking in a specific kind of space, and you end up rethreading the same steps over and over again. So what you want to do in this process is deliberately counteract that by forcing yourself to draw something that's specifically trying to differentiate from the previous one. So if you have drawn for your previous lesson, for example, a two-legged robot, it would be good to specifically then challenge yourself to draw a robot with 4 legs or 6 legs, so that you're forced to go to a kind of different mental space. A couple of other variables you can work with is size. This means that you can make a mech that looks very small, like maybe, for example, the height of a human being, or you could make a mech that's massive, that could be like the size of a skyscraper. This is a good example, a very extreme example of deliberately playing with scale to differentiate. Other ones are things like horizontality or verticality, skinniness and thickness. For example, you can make a very thin robot that looks very frail, but you can also then, to counteract it, make as thick and chunky of a robot as you can. Similarly, you can make a very tall robot that has very long legs, and then you can make a very wide robot that's very wide with very small legs and a big body. Varying the proportions between limbs, body, and different arrangements of that body is also a good way to approach it. Things like, for example, saying that one mech has a cockpit, the other one is fully enclosed, the other one might have a full head and torso, like for example number 5 has. These are a lot of examples on how you can deliberately try and explore differently. You're trying to force yourself. So when you then have thumbnails aligned together, it should feel like every single one of them is very distinctly different from all the other ones. And that is a good way of trying to approach it. You're deliberately trying that every sketch is completely different from all the other sketches. So the homework for this lesson is going to be to make at least 3 more thumbnails using essentially the same process as we did for the last lesson. And I want them to be lined up, similar to how I've done here, next to each other. And what you would want to achieve for that homework is that when they are all lined up next to each other, there's a very clear difference between all of them. A good way to try and visually show the difference between them the best is to all execute them in a very similar way. So if you, for example, chosen to do them, your previous thumbnail in pencil, with like a thicker outline with pen, then I would recommend you to do the next thumbnails in the same process, because then if they all are drawn in the same style, it is easier to see what differences are between them. If you've all drawn them in a completely different style, it'll be harder to judge whether or not they're really all that different from a conceptual level. Now for my thumbnails here, I've gone into a fair amount of detail already. I would say this is probably far too much detail. You want to keep fixated on, well, you want to keep focused on delivering a set of ideas that serve as a blueprint for later drawings. You do not want to be carried away with making really good looking drawings for the sake of good looking drawings, because this might sabotage your ability to creatively think, your ability to challenge yourself with shapes and ideas. For example, if you're drawing thumbnails and you're getting too caught up getting all the shapes right in perspective, this is likely to make you choose more conservative shapes in order to keep things correct in perspective. Similarly, if you do too much perspective buildup, if you try and be too precise about all of the perspective lines, this can easily make your drawings more stiff and make your design choices more stiff, because it'll be harder to draw a crazy shape as a body, because it will be too difficult in a quick pace to actually draw that full shape. If you already know the shape you want to draw, it is a lot easier to do all the complicated build-up later to really construct it. If you are inventing a shape and also forced to technically execute it to a high level, it can easily sabotage your ability to think of a cool shape. So keep focused on that goal and make the drawings that allow you to get to that goal. Do not make the drawings wanting them to look super nice and then realize that you're not actually being able to do your design process. So here's a series of thumbnails where this deliverable is more clearly visible, where they are simpler, just using primitives, but they both, again, show different ideas, different arrangements, similarly to what I've done in this far more detailed page.